Good morning. I'm Brian Winter, the Vice President of American Society Council of the Americas. Thank you for joining us for today's panel on the political and economic scene in Brazil. I'd like to express our gratitude to Telefónica, our webcast sponsor today, and also extend a special welcome to the members of our board who are present. I moved to Sao Paulo as a reporter in 2010. That was a magical year for Brazil. The economy grew 7.6%. Dilma Rousseff was elected president. The country was preparing for the World Cup, which everyone knew Brazil would surely win. And the Olympics was right around the corner. Some American investors had even begun referring to Brazil in private as the near China, confident the economy would continue to post healthy growth rates of 5-6% for the foreseeable future. Well, it didn't turn out that way. I lived in Brazil for 5 years and participated in many forums similar to the one that we're having here today. And of course, it became increasingly obvious over time that things weren't going well. And by 2013 or 2014, it became fashionable to say, well, it wasn't as good as it seemed then, and it's not as bad as it seems now. But here's the unsettling thing. We were all wrong. I mean, spectacularly wrong. No one was ever pessimistic enough. Every single year, growth came in well below forecast. A year ago, no one predicted, that I know of anyway, that the economy would shrink more than 2% in 2015, or that Dilma Rousseff would be seriously threatened by impeachment proceedings, that the Brazilian stock market would lose half its value in a year and be worth less than Apple, or that one agency would strip Brazil of its coveted investment grade rating. In fact, just about 20 minutes ago, the real opened trading in Sao Paulo at 4.002 per dollar, which is its lowest level ever. So, after that heartwarming introduction, we have a truly first-class panel with us today. Mauro is the Vice President of the Sovereign Risk Unit at Moody's Investors Service. João Augusto Castro Neves is Director of Latin America for the Eurasia Group. And Vladimir Werning is Head of Latin America Research for JP Morgan. Thank you all for being here today. Our challenge today is to look honestly and directly at what is an extremely complex situation. And we want to avoid excessive pessimism, but we also want to recognize that most of the pundits over the last couple of years have been wrong on Brazil. We want to talk about whether we're near an inflection point. We want to talk about if we're thinking creatively enough about how dark things could get. So that's why we're here. It's a great audience. Thank you for being here. Let me start the first question for Mauro. Like I said, I was a journalist for the last 5 years, and Mauro, old habits die hard. And so I want to sort of go straight to the point. I know that there are some people here today to hear your thoughts on Brazil as someone who works for one of the big three ratings agencies. Last month, your agency, Moody's, downgraded Brazil to Baa3, which is the lowest rung of investment grade. But you assigned Brazil a stable outlook. And so my question for you is, do you currently believe Brazil can maintain its investment grade status with your agency? And what does it need to do so? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. The question that we usually get is, so now that your competitors did something about the rating, what are you going to do? What are you thinking? So let me be clear about something. If and when we change our views about the rating, that will not be because of what others think about Brazil. It would be only if the evolution of the economy or the evolution of the fiscal accounts is different from that we anticipated. Now, what are our views about Brazil in terms of what supported our rating decision? I would name 3 factors: baseline projection, alternative scenarios, and peer comps. Baseline projection. In terms of the discussion that we had about Brazil, our expectation is that there would be a recession this year and next year. that we will see weak fiscal accounts this year and next year, and that because of that, the debt ratio would increase this year and next year. So our views about the near term, but I'm talking about this year and next year, are negative, in line with what you were saying. At the same time, we looked at alternative scenarios, even more negative scenarios. And maybe the most important finding in terms of what we did is that under most scenarios, what we saw is that there would be a convergence of the debt to GDP ratio towards 70%, even with weak growth this year and next year. This idea of convergence towards 70% and not that it would continue to increase was an important element behind our decision to downgrade, but with a stable outlook. And there are two elements that are required for that to be true. Growth of at least 2% and a primary surplus of at least 2%. And we think that that could be the case after 2016. So the focus of our discussion really was, to a large extent, recognizing the problems this year and next year of what the Brazilian economy could look like after 2016. So those are the assumptions. In terms of the peer comps, we expect that, as I said, the debt to GDP will be approaching 70%. There are other countries, not many, but there are other countries at the same rating, BAA, that have similar debt to GDP ratios. India has a rating, a debt to GDP of about 65%. Bahamas, that is also BAA rated, has a ratio of 68%. So there are others. But more importantly, we look at countries that had been investment grade and that are no longer investment grade to see what happened there and if we thought that that could happen with Brazil. Two cases that we looked at, Croatia and Hungary. In the case of Croatia, if you look at the last 8 years, debt to GDP in Croatia went from 35 to almost 100. Okay, a significant increase. In the case of Brazil, it's going from 55 to about 70, Croatia 35 to 100, and it lost investment grade. In the case of Croatia, during the last 5 years, they have reported negative growth. If you take the last 10 years for Croatia, growth has been on average less than 1%. So, even though Brazil is going through difficult times, we think that on a comparative basis, it doesn't look at this time as bad as Croatia did. The other one is Hungary. In the case of Hungary, what is most important is the exposure in terms of foreign currency exposure to external debt. The government debt, the percentage of foreign currency debt, external debt for the government is about 40%. In the case of Brazil, is 5%. Only 5% of the government debt is denominated in foreign currency, external debt. That's among the lowest that we see in all BAA-rated countries, investment-grade countries. That's an advantage. The other consideration is the coverage of international reserves. Okay? In the case of Brazil, for each dollar that the country has to pay in external debt, that includes government, corporates, and banks. For each dollar that Brazil has to pay, they have $3 backing that in reserves. In the case of Hungary, for each dollar that they have to pay, they have 75 cents. So that's a big difference. So when we do the comps, we think that even though, once again, there are clear weaknesses present in Brazil, they're not as bad as those that we saw when we downgraded countries. What is going to happen? Well, it will depend on the trends, but so far, based on our assumptions, we think that the elements that are there support the rating and the outlook. It will depend on how things evolve this year and next year.
Let me ask one quick follow-up question, then I'll move on to our other panelists. Since you made that downgrade and put the ratings, put the outlook at stable, you had the President Rousseff's government set a budget with a big hole in it to Congress, and the political situation has gotten worse. Has that changed your thinking about the medium term at all?
I think it has increased reservations, concerns that we have about the medium term. I should point out, as I said, we did alternative scenarios where we contemplated lower growth and even weaker fiscal accounts. So that was part of the exercise that we did. We didn't look only at one number. What I should say is that so far the things that we have seen, are leaning more in the opposite, the negative direction. If that continues to be the case, then it's possible that the trends that we were anticipating will not materialize, but we still have to see.
Okay, thank you. Vladimir, this is the worst recession for Brazil in 25 years. How close is the economy to bottoming out?
Well, this is a good question because one of the adjustment valves of the economy this time around versus other periods of difficulties, and one virtue and advantage, not just of Brazil, but of many countries in Latin America, has been the adjustment of the exchange rate. When one has adjusts to shocks, domestic or externally, through the exchange rate, at some point you get import substitution after import compression. So first you have a recession with import compression, then you have import substitution, and eventually you get some export-led growth. So what we would be looking for as an inflection point would in particular be the industry, and yet we haven't seen any good news out of there yet. We saw Fundación Getulio Vargas business confidence down at a minimum historically this week. We see industrial production continuing to contract, so not even stabilizing. And on a 3-month annualized basis, economic activity overall is contracting at a 6% pace. So even our forecast of a 3% annualized contraction for this quarter is in danger of being outperformed in terms of the speed of adjustment. So the economy continues to adjust. The automatic stabilizers are there to provide for a turnaround in the economy, but we have not yet seen it. Financial costs in particular are rising quite rapidly, both on external front as well as domestic, given the central bank tightening cycle and the widening of CDS. So this is offsetting the situation in terms of the profitability that the tradable sector can obtain through the currency weakness. And this difficulty in terms of financing cost is a big burden for growth going forward. Also, I'd particularly highlight that we continue to see the labor market adjustment going forward. And one of the challenges of Brazil is the highly indexed wage mechanisms. So unfortunately, probably this cycle, we will continue to see a significant spike in unemployment. Labor compensation is already slowing down rapidly, and that is yes.
How high do you think the unemployment rate could go? I mean, it's something like, it's on the order of 8% right now.
Yeah, I think, it's not unthinkable to see double-digit unemployment in Brazil, given the pace of the current contraction. So, in dollar terms, wages have gone down sharply, and that's, again, part of the adjustment mechanism. But domestic demand remains quite soft, and the external adjustment itself is not yet kicking in. I think importantly, and our colleague here will offer us some views, the politics is key to the turnaround in sentiment. I think the politics is not only generating challenges and difficulties in Congress around the budget that you mentioned, but it's also affecting and paralyzing investment decisions. So in that respect, I think the political views would surely be an important input to the outlook for the economy.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's turn to politics now with João. You're in Brazil and in Brasilia a lot, as we were discussing before the event. The political buzzword of the moment is impeachment. The Eurasia group currently puts the odds of President Rousseff finishing her government at 60%. My question for you, João, is how does this end? I mean, what is the scenario under which President Rousseff is able to finish her term, given that we have all these economic problems that we've already discussed, and her largest coalition partner, the PMDB, seemingly on the verge of a break with the government? I mean, and her approval rating at 7% and so forth. I mean, how does she make it to 2018 at this point?
Well, first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I think that there's no easy way out of this crisis. But before I say why, it's important to highlight that I don't think also that this is a institutional crisis that Brazil is going through. Right? This is a very deep economic crisis that is combined with the government's incapacity to respond to it effectively. So basically a combination of a deep political and economic crisis, and not an institutional crisis in the strict sense, because in fact, if you look at the institutions in Brazil, part of the reasons why we have this crisis, especially the corruption scandal that kind of broke out, and we see investigations, that institutions in Brazil work. You have an independent judiciary, investigators that have autonomy to investigate what needs to be investigated without political interference. I mean, if you look across the region, where you have a lot of corruption scandals pop up in recent years, in Mexico, close to President Peña Nieto, and in Chile, close to President Bachelet, the list goes on. In a lot of these cases, nothing happened, right? And in Brazil, what you see is actually a robust set of institutions, although, of course, it requires some elements that the current government does not have in order to govern effectively. But so I would say that that's not an institutional crisis. But there's no easy way out, and I think our base case scenario, when you look at Brazil, is one in which she does finish her term, she survives, but just not strong enough to deliver what most people expect or markets expect when it comes to fiscal adjustment and the measures needed to fully correct the course. It's going to be a subpar, a behind the curve adjustment. We do acknowledge, though, that after her re-election last year, that the government became more aware of the mistakes that they committed. In fact, we used to say that her second administration, her second term, would be the mirror image of her first term, meaning that it would be characterized by a slow unwinding of all the more state-centric measures, the intervention in the economy that they've implemented in the first term, weaning the sectors from subsidies, etc. But at the same time, while she had a lot of political capital throughout most of her first term, she would have declining political capital throughout her second term, meaning that she would be less capable, even if more aware of what needs to be done, less capable to conduct these changes. So kind of the mirror image of that. So we see this kind of very slightly constructive, or not even constructive, muddle throughout. But of all the alternatives out there, we think that that's the least worst scenario, because we don't think that an impeachment process, even though we still think it's unlikely, it's not negligible. We give a 40% chance that she will not finish her term. For a country like Brazil, where the bar is high for you to get to be impeached, that's not negligible. But we do not see an impeachment as a quick fix to the problem. I think there will be many challenges that a post-Rousseff government would face.
Yeah, no, I think it's clear that, and part of the reason Congress and some of the opposition parties have not moved on impeachment yet is because they realize that the day after impeachment, it doesn't solve your problems. But it's just hard for me to see right now how that idea of impeachment has been so out there for like 6, 7, 8 months now, and you have people like Michel Temer saying things like, I don't see how a government with approval ratings that low can get to the end, can survive. And we also we seem to be in agreement on the likelihood that the economy is going to stay on its back for some time to come. So there just seems to be so much momentum built up around the impeachment idea right now, even though there is no legal case against the president specifically right now.
No, for sure. I mean, and when you look at what what we label informally our base case scenario for Brazil as a long and painful adjustment, meaning that we did think that before that the crisis both political and economic crisis would peak at some point before the end of this year. I think what we revised in the last couple of weeks is that we think there are elements to believe that the crisis will consume most of 2016, right? So we do see the valley kind of extending a little bit, and it will be, and the recovery that we're going to have starting 2017 will be very slow, and essentially, and combined then with a lame duck president that was starting to reach the end of her term. But to your point, I think the impeachment, the fact that she is weak, I think that she does face a lot of problems and issues of lack of capacity to govern. But there's no smoking gun, right? There's no clear proof, and I think that the reason. So we like the idea that that she's close to the brink. I think, and will remain close to the brink. But no one wants to be that one giving that final push, because it will first of all, create a very dangerous precedent if you interpret the existing evidence If you're too creative to find mechanisms to remove her from office, that creates a very dangerous precedent for Brazil. That in any deep political economic crisis, this could happen to anyone else. And keep in mind that she's very weak in terms of approval ratings. Yes, 9, 8, single digits. Approval rating is lower than the interest rates, so that tells you a lot. But at the same time, she does have support from social movements in Brazil, right? Even though if that doesn't reflect on her numbers, you look at labor unions, students, they're against the austerity package that they are implementing, right? But they're not in favor of her impeachment. And that makes it different. She's not like Fernando Collor, who was impeached in '92, who was completely isolated. So just keep in mind that if the PT were to be ousted, removed from power, the PT would move back to the left and become a very radical, noisy opposition in Congress and in the streets. So that's why I think that the cost of an impeachment is very, even if you have the smoking gun, the process may last from 6 to 12 months, right? So even if we believe that the alternative to Rousseff, a PMDB-led government or a PSDB-led government, would be better in terms of policymaking, and most people believe yes, it would, the starting point of that government would be lower than where we are today, given how protracted and very noisy that impeachment process may be. And then that government, PMDB or PSDB government, would face many challenges of having to implement the same recipe in terms of economic management. So protests in the streets will likely remain with different colors. An alliance between the two parties, the PMDB, PSDB, is not that trivial, given that they compete in 2018, and they would face a very radical opposition in Congress.
Can I make a comment?
Of course.
So impeachment and politics. Impeachment. About 2 months ago, I was in Brazil doing the visit for the committee, and we spent 2 days in Sao Paulo. And several of the Paulistas I met with viewed impeachment as a positive development. Actually, they asked me, so do you think that impeachment is great positive, that the grade would be better because of impeachment? We don't. We think that there are several elements involving uncertainty as to the outcome after the impeachment. But several people think that it could be positive in Brazil. So that's, I just want to mention that. Now, having said that, I think that we're focusing too much on impeachment. That the key is politics. And how do we look at politics? The way in which we understand politics is the ability to reach consensus, political consensus. The minimum consensus required to approve certain measures that are required. In this case, to be very specific, say the next year's budget. Okay? And a key element there is the CPMF. Without that, you really have a very bad outlook for the budget. So far, we have not seen the ability to reach consensus. And I think this is having an impact on confidence, on business sentiment, and that is what driving to a large extent the weak growth, along with other elements. So the question is if there will be the will and the ability to reach a consensus between the government and one important institution, that is Congress. And we think that what is really important in that case is the relationship between the government and the PMDB. And when I think of PMDB, I think of the unholy trinity. So you have Temer, you have Cunha, you have Calleiros. So depending on how the relationship goes with those three key people, that could determine, if the government and if Brazil is able to reach consensus, as I said, the minimum consensus. And I think that's what we have at this time is uncertainty as to if there's the will and ability to get to that point. And the first test, as I said, a critical one would be next year's budget.
I agree. I mean, looking at that trinity of leaders and looking at the PMDB and its alliance with the Workers' Party, do you believe they're closer right now to a deal on the budget, or they're closer to a split that would take the PMDB out of the government?
There's no evidence that I know of that they're closer to reaching a deal, other than the alternative is really scary, or it should be really scary for everyone. I think that the opposition has been willing to push very hard for extreme positions regarding almost everything, including the budget. In the case of the PMDB, I really don't know. There's a high level of uncertainty, and I think that right now it could go in either direction. Maybe they can reach an agreement, maybe they cannot. Maybe João has a better sense, but at this time we really are somewhere in the middle. I think that for us is 50-50. They may or they may not.
Well, what we think is happening is that, well, the short answer is that I don't think they will deliver, basically, the adjustment the way that they're promising. I think that I think the government is being able to exploit the growing fears within the business elites and some of the political elites to at least contain the negative fiscal agenda because it's not only a difficulty of implementing the positive adjustment austerity agenda, but also preventing the negative agenda from going forward. Because there's a laundry list of so-called fiscal bombs in Congress. In fact, today there are 3 presidential vetoes that could be overridden today, and so I think that the negative fiscal agenda is we don't think will move forward. So that's a positive thing, because for these parties like the PMDB and even the PSTB, it did make sense for them to threaten in the beginning, but when it becomes close to actually becoming a reality, it's going to affect not only the Rousseff government, but whoever takes over in the next couple of years, if some say decades. So the all or nothing strategy does not pay off, and I think the more responsible, more enlightened leaders of Congress, I think that they understand this. But that ability to exploit the fears of the business elites does not automatically translate into support for these austerity measures. I think the government may have something. For example, early in the year, they sent 4 measures to Congress. They approved all 4. There was some watering down, some dealing with entitlements, etc., payroll, unwinding the payroll tax exemption. What we think now is that those measures that they sent now to Congress, they're going to be even less successful in getting those through Congress. What this means is that some will be approved. I think that this will reduce the quality of the fiscal, right? They have to rely more on unilateral measures, on raising the CG fuel tax that does not require Congress. Is not a good tax, but they'll have to resort to it. We think eventually they will. Non-recurrent sources of revenue as well, with the repatriation tax of non-declared assets abroad. I mean, you have a list of things that will buy the government some time and get some resources to the government's coffers, but will not mean anything in terms of the sustainability of the fiscal in longer term. I think for that, the government needs to signal one thing, or actually 2 things that I think the government hasn't done yet. One, have Rousseff take the lead of these measures, right? When you look in Brazil's past, Lula has stepped forward to defend measures that he needed to defend. Cardoso before him as well. In this case, she never spoke directly about her adjustment, right? She never announced measures. So that gives us a little bit of uncertainty regarding how the degree of commitment, her commitment to the adjustment. And you have 2 strong economic ministers within the economic team, which in Brazil, that is complicated. If you look at the last 40 years, usually a strong finance minister equals a weak planning minister and vice versa. You don't have 2 strong economic ministers in the same team. And finally, the government needs to present also a longer game plan, what they want to do, even if a lot of the measures are not likely to pass, at least they're marking a position. Near-term solutions, longer term, like reform, pension, etc. And they haven't done that. I think if she would take the lead and present a longer game plan, would it increase the odds of these passing? Maybe not, but at least it would reduce some of the uncertainty in the markets today regarding the degree of commitment that this government has to implement these measures.
Well, thank you. And I want to talk a little bit about this notion of a positive agenda, right? And these policies that could get Brazil back on the path to growth. Maybe not this year, maybe not even next year, but the things that would be necessary to get us back on something resembling a sustainable path. Mauro, you talked about debt ratios in Brazil relative to other countries, and of course, part of that has to be addressed on the fiscal side, but it's also, it's a truism that no country has ever cut its way to fiscal sustainability. There needs to be something on the growth side too, both economically and politically, because if you don't show the Brazilian people some sort of path ahead that's positive and that involves growth, it's not going to work out well. So I'd like to start with you, Vladimir. I mean, what possibility, if any, do you see of some sort of positive agenda? What do you think is necessary in terms of reforms or in terms of policy moves to eventually to hasten the day when this economy will start growing again?
Well, first of all, I think in crisis times is when generally the pressure is higher and you have the opportunity of making reforms. It's not as common to see reforms going on in stable times. So there is an opportunity here. However, I think the approval ratings mentioned before being so low, the difficulties with Congress makes sort of a more ambitious reform plan here very difficult. You need leadership, you need cooperation, coordination to get through a more ambitious reform agenda. I think what we're looking for here, what investors are looking for, is the fiscal situation, providing some relief, some improvements there. The minister's making a lot of efforts in terms of quasi-fiscal policy. This is in some form a stealth fiscal adjustment. It's reining back the excess lending of public institutions, public banks. This is an issue similar to what investors are looking at in China. With after the Great Recession, some of the big emerging economies increased their domestic credit significantly as a counter-cyclical tool. That continued even as the economies recovered. So there was an excess buildup of credit. So I think there's some very basic macro adjustments that need to take place before we get into the structural agenda. I do think there was a mention about Social Security as part of a long-term agenda involving fiscal responsibility. I think investors do look to that as an important anchor for expectations. One of the issues that was a big concern in previous years was the overvaluation of the real.
No longer.
I think right now, that has been addressed by the more flexible exchange rate policy the minister has embraced. Before, the exchange rate was being used as an anchor for inflation. Now the central bank has taken the responsibility of using interest rate policy more firmly against inflation. And I think bringing down inflation is also part of the agenda. Countries with high inflation tend over time to be more inefficient, to grow less. And one of the things concerning Latin America in general, I think, for investors is not just the short-term growth, but potential growth. We've seen debates not just in Brazil, but in Chile, in Colombia, in Mexico, where investors are being more cautious about their expectations of long-term potential growth. So that involves, getting investment up, getting productivity up. But these are difficult microeconomic reforms. They're very detailed, very sector-specific, and I think right now the urgency of the macro adjustment currently is much more important for investor sentiment than micro measures. It's very difficult for the market to be able to understand, micro measures and add them up and turn around sentiment based on that. I think you need more broad sweeps of policy signals. And I think the political coordination is really the implementation risk. It's not about design. I think the minister came into office, Levy, with a very clear mindset of what to do and conviction and presidential support. But the short circuits in getting the implementation through, I think, is currently the circuit break.
Mauro, same question for you. I mean, do you believe the government's doing enough on the growth side?
Well, I think that at present, there are other problems that are more significant than growth. I mean, in the very near term. I think that when you think in terms of the agenda, you have to break it in near term, medium term, long term. Near term, the big issue for us is next year's budget. And that means getting as close as possible to 0.7 in terms of the primary surplus, or try to avoid having a primary deficit, because it would be the third consecutive year where there's a primary deficit. And keep in mind that the standard in Brazil used to be that it was a surplus of 3%, so it's a big difference. And for that, given the fact the economy is so weak, you have to go mostly through revenues. in terms of trying to increase revenues which have suffered. And once again, the CPMF, it's hard to see that the government will be able to get to the number that they're trying to get in the absence of the CPMF. And it's hard to see they can get to the CPMF if there is no agreement or consensus, political consensus, to move in that direction. That is the very near term. Then you have the medium term that I think it also has a fiscal focus, but it has to do more with spending. It has to do with, as Vladimir said, the key factor has to do with pension payments and how to de-link the indexation of pension payments. And that has to do also with minimum wages and how they're determined. And that involves politics. The other factor in terms of the medium-term adjustment with spending has to do with social programs. If you look at the revenues, the government will not be able to fund all the social programs that they have. And they have to cut back. I mean, there's no way around that. And some programs that are very close and dear to the president. Mia Casa, Mia Vida. So things like that have to be on the table. Otherwise, the numbers do not add up. So in the very near term and in the medium term, you have fiscal, revenues, expenditures. In terms of the longer term, I think there are two areas that are very important. In that respect, I think they have identified them. Infrastructure, the infrastructure program that actually they tried to launch last administration, but it didn't work. And Petrobras, or the oil sector, or the opening of the oil sector to the private investment. For you to be able to do step 1, 2, 3, you need political consensus. And as I said, at this time, there's no indication, but you won't be able to get to the long-term growth component before you address the near-term fiscal one.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to, in just a moment, I'd like to open up questions for our audience that's here, but before I do, let me ask João a political question based on some of what was just said. You know, we've focused a lot on politics, basically in Brasilia, right, and looking at Temer and the PMDB and Congress and the finance ministry and all these other players. The kinds of adjustments we're talking about here, with adjustments to social programs, with tax increases, in a context of rising unemployment, is the Brazilian street going to tolerate that?
No, I think we're headed into difficult, more tension-prone years in terms of presidential approval ratings and protests. I think that, in fact, if you look more broadly, if you look at the last 20, 30 years in Brazil, the last 6 or 7, where you had Lula at the height of 80% approval ratings, or even Dilma, who inherited most of that for some time, that was the outlier, right? We're back to the norm of Brazilian politics, where presidential approval, of course, now I would say now it's a little bit lower than one would expect, of course, because of the more acute crisis that it's going through right now. But you know, Brazil has been, as you know well, Brazil has been a pretty dysfunctional country in the sense of there are many checks and balances, there are many institutional players. You have 27 states that have a say on reform, on tax reform, for example. You have 33 parties. These dysfunctionality, so to speak, explain why Brazil is a slow mover.
You're
right?
saying these are things that are built into the system because of the Constitution, because of the way things are set up.
Exactly. It may be perfected, of course, but these dysfunctionality, so to speak, they explain why Brazil was a latecomer to the Washington Consensus in the 1990s, for example. Argentina and Chile were way ahead. Brazil haphazardly, Cardoso in 95 started very slowly this path. But there's a silver lining to this dysfunctionality. I think that the silver lining is that these same factors that kind of made Brazil a slow mover, slow reformer, are precisely the same factors that also reduce the risk of more radicalisms, that kind of attenuated the Bolivarian inspiration of 10 years later. And I think so Brazil's political design channel policy making towards more moderate grounds, right? Even if Rousseff were to wake up tomorrow more radical and wants to, do a U-turn on everything, the first point of resistance would be even within her coalition, the PMDB, for example. So I think that it's bad news that it raises the cost of doing business in Brazil. It's hard to understand Brazil. It's this dysfunctionality. But the good side of it is that once you're in, the rule changes they don't change dramatically. Argentina goes from, extreme, the neoliberal 1990s to the Bolivarian 2000s. From every 10 years they go from one extreme to the other. Brazil is always in the middle. Even when Collor was considered Brazil's neoliberal president, there's a lot of state intervention there. So I think that if you look, so to your question, I mean, going forward, in the next 5 years, of course, we don't expect any major positive changes. I think that we do think that she'll survive, and the good news I think would be that I think Brazil will be, even though they're probably not going to deliver everything that they've been promising, they're going to be subpar. I think that we'll be in a better position in 2018, so her last year in government, than we are today. I think kind of clear a lot of the problems that need to be addressed, to the more near-term problems. And the interesting thing, the irony is that the PSDB complains that in Cardoso's second term, they did all the hard work, and Lula took the credit for it, right? Because Lula was the risk, and then he was able to surf the wave. Although there we had the China factor that we don't have anymore, or as strong as it was. What we think the PT is what's likely to happen now, that PT may very well return the favor, do all the hard work now, and then will lead to a next government that starts in 2019 that could have a more positive agenda of reforms, more meaningful, driven out of conviction, not out of necessity. That was the case right now.
It's 4 years away. It's so much time. Let's open this up for a question from the audience. Yes.
Hi. One question. Could you elaborate a little bit on your view regarding interest rates in Brazil and the fact that they are so high, how it impacts fiscal sustainability, and how it impacts growth, and how Brazil can solve this bad equilibrium of lower exchange rate, higher interest rates, lower growth, worse fiscal situation?
This is an excellent question because it's at the basis of what Levy is attempting to do. It's a macroeconomic adjustment that attempts to shift the burden to tighter fiscal and then eventually loosen monetary policy. The current tight monetary policy is not the end game. It's not the sought after result. It's a bridge. It's a bridge to allowing an orderly adjustment of the exchange rate. It's a bridge to cooling off some of the overheating pressures that prior excess fiscal policy and quasi-fiscal policy generated. So I think, as a bridge, the expectation should be that Brazil will be able to cut interest rates next year in support of growth. Now, to get there, the fiscal is important because, as you can see, the way the market prices, CDS spreads have widened. So credit spread component of interest rates is rising. And also the exchange rate volatility, that adds a premium to domestic rates. So today you have the market pricing in hikes going forward, not cuts. And this is not because the market is expecting the central bank to engineer a tighter policy against inflation. Most of inflation is a relative price adjustment, tariff adjustments. It's not about demand side inflation pressure. But you cannot cut interest rates if you do not generate the shift of the burden to a tighter fiscal policy. That's what the market is saying today. So I think, we enjoyed a period where emerging markets in general, not just Brazil, was able to engineer counter-cyclical monetary and fiscal policies during recessions. To the extent that policy has been excessively lax during the subsequent upswing, that possibility of counter-cyclical policy has diminished. In order to regain that capacity to cut interest rates when you're in a recession, which is Brazil, what the minister likely and the central bank president likely aspire to, I think what you need to do is rebalance all the macro policy. And that's why it's so critical on the fiscal, because if you do the fiscal adjustment correct, then credit spreads should go down, financing costs should go down. The central bank should be able to guide interest rates down without having a free fall of the currency.
Mauro, do you have anything to add?
There's another thing that has an impact on interest rates, and that is inflation expectations. Once again, when I was in Sao Paulo, there were two things that I heard. First, this comment about impeachment, and then complaints about the central bank, but different types of complaints. Throughout the years, in every visit to Sao Paulo, the complaint was, the central bank is a joke. these guys are really not committed to fight inflation. The president of central bank is a puppet of the president. The complaint that I heard now is, oh my God, these guys are crazy. They have increased interest rates too much. They have to stop doing this. So clearly the central bank did something that got the attention of the market. And clearly because of that, the market is having different views about what inflation may look like in the future. And inflation expectations have declined. That's not, that all the work is done, but that's an important step. And as long as there's the expectation that inflation will decline, and as long as inflation indeed declines, that could bring inflation closer to the midpoint of the range, closer to the 4.5, and that would give the central bank space to eventually reduce interest rates. The thing is that in the near term, once again, and by that I mean this year, next year, there's really limited policy space from the standpoint of the government on the fiscal side and from the standpoint of the central bank. Now, the central bank already did everything that you can argue that they had to do in terms of pushing the interest rates up. The government still has to do the adjustments on the fiscal front. So what we're going to see, and there's no way around that, the policy in the near term will be pro-cyclical. The economy is weak, but at the same time, the central bank is tightening, and the government has to tighten. That's the way it's going to be, and part of that explains why the economy is so weak in addition to the other factors. Hopefully, if things work out, and if you add, once again, the confidence component, which is critical, which has to do with politics and consensus, then eventually there could be more space. But in terms of this year and next year, is basically adjustment in a pro-cyclical environment.
Let me ask one follow-up question, then we'll go back to the audience, and it's for João. And this is probably my fault, we've scarcely mentioned Petrobras. And that, of course, is a background to all of this. Do you anticipate, João, that there will be continued developments in the Lava Jato investigation that make these kinds of political deal-making that we're talking about here more difficult?
Yeah, when you look at the corruption scandal around Petrobras and the main construction companies in Brazil, I mean, it's hard to handicap given that there's a huge legal element to it, not political element to it. But ironically, this scandal is undermining two of the key sectors that are believed to be the drivers for growth for Brazil, the infrastructure sector and the oil sector. Although we do think that this will lead to positive restructuring in both sectors, we're already seeing the infrastructure, the new concessions agenda, for example, and even in Petrobras, I think it will force relaxation of some of the more interventionist policies and local content, Petrobras' role. But if you look at the corruption, but the problem is that how long will this restructuring last? Because there's a great unknown of the pace of the corruption, the investigations. We've been for over a year and a half now of investigations. And we like to, compare it to what happened in Italy in the early 1990s with the Operation Clean Hands. There, it lasted 3 or 4 years. There was a huge impact on the markets there. Led to Berlusconi later. At the one hand, it wiped Italian political system from the main traditional parties and led to create this vacuum that led to Berlusconi. So I think on that front, Brazil has the risk is smaller. I think that. We've had our Berlusconi, our outsider, I think not long ago, with Collor. I think that the political system is traumatized to elect someone from the outside. But at the same time, Italy also was going through that process while they were joining the euro. So there were some macroeconomic buffers there, and Brazil doesn't have that. So we lose on that comparison. But if you talk to some Italians, ask them now, when did the Operation Clean Hands end? Some would tell you that it still hasn't ended 20 years later. But I think that there are some elements that can give this investigation more legs going forward. I think that at some point next year, maybe by the middle of next year, it's hard to pinpoint, it will eventually start to lose steam. Because this is, again, what I said in the beginning, right, that you have a lot of institutional mechanisms that give this autonomy. You have plea bargains that are being negotiated that there weren't before during the Mensalão scandal 10 years ago, for example, that this can give, add more fuel to the fire. I think we see the Lava Jato corruption scandal still as the main risk to President Dilma Rousseff, because if it does reach if it gets closer to former President Lula, for example, or the BNDES, for example, it has an impact to both undermining economic recovery because then it metastasizes, it gets all the sectors paralyzed. It also has the power to, if it gets closer to Lula, isolate her, and then we'll have that condition that I mentioned that we don't have yet. She's very unpopular, but she still has support from social movements. If it gets close to Lula and the PT, that would lead probably a break. She probably would distance herself from Lula and probably lose the support from social movements, and that be more vulnerable to an impeachment process.
Wow, okay, thank you. We have about 10 minutes left, so I want to take some more questions from the audience. Yes, you in the blue shirt. And then let's try to get somebody from the back after that.
Nobody discussed systemic risk, especially with the size of the problem in Petrobras spilling over to the banks. The banks face several sectors that are literally going bankrupt. Regardless if they book it or not, it's happening. So I'm interested, nobody touched on that topic, and what do you think about that?
Let me just combine that. Let's take one more question also from the back. Yes.
Hi, Patrick Gillespie with CNN. Only 5 years ago, Brazil could make a case for the best performing economy in Latin America. Today, when you look across all the metrics, debt rating, economic performance, equity performance, is there a clear top performer in Latin America today?
Okay, thank you. Let's start with the systemic risk question first. Does anyone here want to address that?
I think that when you talk about Petrobras and the systemic risk as it comes through the banking system, I think that it has to do more with the impact of the Petrobras problems on suppliers, and the companies that do business with Petrobras, and our banking team has looked at that. And there are several companies that are in a weak position because of that. However, that does not relate into a systemic banking problem, okay? You can look at the numbers of the different banks, individual banks, or of the system as such, the level of provisions, the level of liquidity, the level of capital. So it's the risk of a systemic banking crisis because of Petrobras, I think, is limited. However, there may be clearly are problems for some companies and possibly for some medium-sized banks. I think that the systemic risk is related more to growth, because one of the reasons why the economy is so weak, in addition to the pro-cyclical policies, in addition to the lack of confidence, has to do with, as João was saying, the fact that Petrobras is at the center of the economy. In terms of the direct and indirect impact, is significant. And if you look at you want to put it that way, the negative multiplier effect of the Lava Jato in terms of the economic and fiscal consequences, that explains a big chunk of the contraction of the economy. So in that respect, I think that it's systemically important. When it comes to the banking system, we have not seen that it can be, as I said.
And Vladimir, you look at Latin America as a whole, you seem like the right person to answer this second question. I mean, it's a tough moment for the whole region right now, with maybe a couple exceptions. Who's the star of Latin America at the moment?
Maybe there's a small island that we don't know the name of somewhere. I think it's a hard time for Latin America in general, because we have a significant commodity price shock, and this is affecting the region. A lot of the companies that have invested heavily and contributed to growth face now less profitability, and this means that investment to GDP ratios will be lower, so growth should be expected to be lower. Different countries are managing the shock differently. I think Mexico has made a push for supply side reforms before the commodity shock. That generated a lot of encouragement. And I think to some extent it's been unlucky with the prices of oil, given its opening of its sector. Mauro mentioned, or I think it was Mauro, you mentioned about oil sector opening up competition in Brazil, for instance, which is something that in Mexico, like in Brazil, maybe today, seemed unimaginable, and yet they changed the constitution, they pushed forward. So a lot of supply side efforts, and I think one of the key issues is after the Great Recession, which countries in the process of broadening the welfare state, which was a key political issue on the agenda, were also mindful of supply-side reforms. Most countries were not. Most countries banked on demand-side management of their economies, and I think Mexico does stand out on the supply side. Now, these benefits do not come quickly. They may come slowly, and investors, which may have a short time horizon, may not be thrilled. But I think in that respect, Mexico has the upside from that particularity.
Is that the lesson from all this? Is it that when times are good, you need to look at the countries that are doing their homework anyway, in terms of supply side reforms in particular?
Well, I think, yeah, you should be doing your homework all the time. I think one of the issues is that in terms of the high growth rates we had in Latin America during this past decade, there was a clear signal from the population to politicians, which was about, support for the welfare state, broader entitlements. Politicians cannot ignore this. The question is, how do you, allocate these entitlements without putting at risk the macro performance? And unfortunately, many times, shocks to the macroeconomy are unexpected. So, what's going on in China? I think one big challenge for Latin America in general is for politicians to be able to convey the message that, all these promises that have been made, eventually, at better times, may be able to continue to be pushed forward, reducing income inequality, et cetera. But the urgency of the current situation does make it more difficult to deliver in the short term. Those governments that are able to do that will be able, I think, to improve the approval ratings. Approval ratings are not just low in Brazil, they're low across the region.
That's right.
So this issue of, but I think in no other place is the issue of coordination between Congress and the executive so complicated as it is in Brazil. Look at Mexico. They had midterm elections. There was a lot of sense that PRI would not do well. They didn't do that bad given expectations. In Chile, there's also issues around Bachelet's reform agenda, but there's not a sense of there's a sense of political divergence of agenda vis-a-vis what the private sector might be looking for, but there's not a sense that Congress couldn't contribute to a process of reforms if they were presented by the president. So I think this is, in general, I'd say there is room for hope. I just think in the short term, the amount of pressures the economies are facing, the need for adjustment is going to limit the upside.
I'd like to take one more question from the audience, and then we'll wrap things up. I have one final question for our group as well. Anyone out there? Yes.
Thanks. Mauro, so what specifically are you looking for if there are going to be a revision of the rating or a downgrade? What specifically are you looking for? And also, there's a lot of market chatter about the veto votes tonight from Congress. Does that have anything to do with a revision in the future?
Well, to be honest, I don't think that we're looking specifically for anything. What are we looking for?
You mentioned the budget.
Yes, well, in terms of events or signs, the first event has to do, well, the vote on the vetoes is an indication of that balance of power or the agreement. I don't know if you read the press, I don't know if it was today or yesterday, but Cunha said that, they should support the vetoes. I don't know if that will fly or not, but that's a good sign. At the end of the day, what it would come to is the vote. So that's a sign if there are indications that they're able to reach the minimum consensus required. The second point would be, as I said, the budget. And in the budget, I'm sorry for repeating myself for the third time, it's hard to see that the budget numbers will add up in the absence of the CPMF, because in the near term, it's going to be very difficult to adjust spending. Okay? So therefore, you have to, even though that's not maybe the most efficient solution, it's possibly the only solution given the way things are. So those are two key events. Of course, impeachment, if there's a formal impeachment process launched, and that could change the dynamics. One thing that we do not incorporate into our baseline is an event like that of an impeachment. We think that an impeachment is not create positive because it introduces an element of uncertainty. So if that were to be the case, and I'm speaking about a formal impeachment process, not the calls that, that maybe we should be looking at this as it is now in Congress, then that could change the dynamics. So I think those are key elements. And more than us, I think that the business community, and by that I mean the Brazilian business community and the international business community, they are looking for signs that, once again, there's this will and ability to reach consensus. That is what's going to be important in terms of the growth prospects.
Thank you. As a final thought, I mean, I started today by talking about essentially how spectacularly wrong the Brazil watchers have been over the last 5 years, and a group that certainly includes myself. And my final thought is, are we at risk of getting it wrong again? I mean, are we being too pessimistic? I remember 2002 when the situation looked pretty bleak, and Lula was on the verge of being elected, and people were talking about another lost Latin American decade in the wake of the Argentine crisis and some other things that were going on. And of course, then you saw the entry, a real rise in commodities demand from China, and it turned out to be a great decade for Latin America. So my question is there something out there? Is there some, not a miracle? I mean, it has to be within the realm of possibility. But what would the scenario be under which Brazil would do much better over the next 3 to 5 years than we've been talking about today? João, maybe I could offer that one to you first.
Well, first of all, I think this won't be a lost decade. It will be a lost half decade, I think. If they revise last year's numbers, GDP growth, and this year a recession next year, potentially 2017. So I think on that front, I mean, it's not as problematic as in the past. But I think you have an interesting point. I mean, usually when you look at Brazil, reactions both from market watchers and Brazilians is very extreme, right? Either things are going too badly or wonderfully good. Either the Christ Redeemer is taking off, according to the economists, or just kind of plunging down. And the truth is somewhere in the middle in Brazil. If you look at, for the reasons that I mentioned here in terms of that, being a slow mover. So, I mean, in our view, we are concerned with this combination of a deep political and economic crisis, but we still think she survives, and we still think that she continues this path, this kind of inflection point of trying to improve policy making, even though constricted by the economic and political environment. So that's, looking at the bigger picture, that's not a very dramatic view. I think that they're paying a price for not doing this earlier. I think the bar, because of the election last year, I think they slowed down this course correction and raised the bar of what needs to be done to just keep things where they are. So looking forward, of course, the China factor is definitely, we don't expect, they can answer better than I can, China to be as a positive factor as it has been in the last 10 years over the next 5 years. So I think that, for Brazil, I think that, but in Brazil, when you look at these moments is when, it's when deep political and economic crisis, when they tighten, when they become more evident, is when the political class tends to respond more constructively, even if slow or maybe some would say too little too late, but this is what happens in Brazil. It happened during the Real plan in '94. It happened when Lula was elected in 2002, and I think we're in the middle of that process right now. So I wouldn't be to say, oh, it's over for Brazil. I think that will be very rough 2-3 years, yes, but I still think that there's still some elephants that were left in the room that are there to stay, and some positive, like the middle class story, the demographic shift, which will require better policy making going forward. It's not a matter of just opening up, credit and a consumption-led growth model. I think Brazil has to transition to an investment-led growth model.
Mauro, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that my answer would be respond without overreacting, which is what we are trying to do with the rating.
You're saying that's what investors should do?
No, in terms of what I don't know what investors should do. I'm not going to give advice to investors. But in terms of what we are trying to do when we're looking at Brazil, and as you pointed out, we were wrong, and all of us collectively as to what was going to happen. What we're trying to do, and what we have done in terms of the rating and the rating decision, is to respond, try to incorporate the events, but at the same time trying to avoid overreacting in terms of how far to go. I think that you were asking also, so is Brazil going to be doing better? Well, better relative to what? It's going to be, we think that it's highly likely they will be doing better relative to what we have seen last year, this year, what we'll see next year. But it looks like it's clearly not going to be doing nearly as good as it did before. Just one case in point, debt to GDP, which is a key indicator for us. For several years, Brazil had a relatively high debt to GDP ratio, but that was at 55, pretty much stable over a 8-year period. Is moving now towards 70, 55, 70. And we think that it's going to remain at 70 even if conditions improve, even if the economy starts growing, even if they make a fiscal adjustment. So in that respect, it's going to be in a different position. The same goes for growth. For a period of time, we all thought about 3 to 4% growth, and now it looks like it will be challenging to get to 2% and maintain 2%. So in that respect, it's going to be a different Brazil. Hopefully, it will be a more stable Brazil with more strong fundamentals, even at a lower growth level, even with a higher debt to GDP. And that has to do with the policies, with the reforms, and once again with the ability to reach the consensus on the measures that have to be adopted.
Okay, thank you. And Vladimir, do you have any final thoughts? We're just about out of time.
Yeah.
But
No, I think, the political coordination and consensus that was mentioned before is critical, because I think some of the economic excesses have been resolved. The exchange rate weakening has been significant. And remember, a few years back, everybody was worried about the overvaluation of the real and what it did for growth. So some of the macroeconomic adjustments are moving forward. The labor market has adjusted. We're seeing some of the elements that would eventually lead to a new macroeconomic equilibrium, but the transition is proving to be slow, and the price mechanisms are not generating necessarily an immediate response, expenditure switching, etc. So the patience is important. Right now, Brazil is in the worst of both worlds. It's announcing austerity, but not being able to implement it. So announcing austerity is obviously generates frictions politically, and not being able to implement it means that markets raise their concerns. We need to see some change in that so that Brazil can benefit from the efforts it's making. If not, the muddle through scenario remains unappealing.
okay, well, thank you. Well, on behalf of America's Society and Council of the Americas, thank you to all of you for being here today. Thank you to our panelists, Mauro, João, Augusto, Castro, Neves, Vladimir Werning. I think we covered a lot of ground today. I think we were very direct to the point. So thank you, and let's give our panelists a big hand.